Yeah. So we were going through AOP in the last class. Today we'll talk about the transaction management support, declarative transaction management support in the AOP. As I told you people, you'll find that transaction management is also one of the cross-cutting consent code. Yes, transaction management is also one of the cross-cutting consent, right? Yeah. So we have to deal with it. So in order to handle the transactions, you see, now today we'll take the help of Spring Framework for that purpose. Yeah. Let me add a method called as add product here. Okay. We just add this method to that interface only. So now generally here this add product method, it helps us to add a product record to the database server, let's say. So first of all, if you want to interact with the database server and perform any DB operations here, we'll take the help of a session, right? Yes, that is a primary component. You know that. Session, let's obtain a session first of all. And then the next immediate thing is whenever you want to perform a non-selected DB operation, if you want to perform a non-selected DB operation, you can make use of transaction. Always Hibernate recommends you people to use a transaction context to perform non-selected DB operations. Okay? You need to always perform that transaction, sorry, non-selected DB operations under the transaction context. So here, now, first of all, we have to obtain a transaction object, and then we need to begin the transaction here, and then you see you can perform that DB operation to add the product record by calling the sessions save method. You can do that. And then you can close the transaction by calling the commit and close the session as well. Yes. So this way you'll be writing that transaction management code. And this code, let me tell you one thing, it's going to be the most redundant stuff. Okay. So I don't want to handle the transactions on my own. You see, you'll find that this code is going to be redundant. Not only in the repositories or DOs, but even you'll find that you'll be writing the transaction management code in the service components also. When you're executing a business logic, yeah, you may need to do that. Yes. So how can we avoid this redundant code, the cross-cutting concern code which you got here? Yes. Yes. For this, first of all, in Hibernate, you'll find that you got something called as transaction manager, which will make use of Hibernate transaction manager. Yes. Just a second, please. Or just give me 1 minute. Sorry, just wanted to open the slide. Let's see. So when we talk about transaction management here, you find that we have a comprehensive transaction support, so transaction management support in Spring Framework. So Spring Framework provides you see a consistent abstraction for transaction management that delivers the following benefits. Okay, consistent programming model across different transaction APIs such as JTA, JDBC, Hibernate, Java, persistence API. So what does that means? That means you see it doesn't matter. So you're dealing with transactions in which API, whether it is JDBC, Hibernate, JPA, whatever it is, you will find that here you'll follow the same approach. Okay, basically you're going to follow the same approach here. Yes. Okay, so uniform approach. So that is one of the advantages here. Yes. Next, support for declarative transaction management. When I say declarative transaction management, what does that mean? Declarative transaction management support means, yes, what does it mean here? That means it will be completely configurations based. So we can just configure how you want the framework to manage the transactions. Okay, you can just configure how you want the framework to manage the transactions. So the framework will take care of managing the transaction for us, handling the transaction for us. Yes. So either we can use annotations or XML for this purpose. Either we can go for XML or annotations for this purpose here. Yes. Next, you see simpler API for programming transaction management. So you'll find that it will be a pretty simple and straightforward. So it won't be that complicated. So these are the various advantages of using the Spring transaction management support. Yes. Now, you see the declarative transaction management. See, the Spring Framework's declarative transaction management is made possible through AOP. Yes, we can use annotations here for that purpose. We can make use of annotations here for this purpose. Okay, so you'll find that Spring Framework, it provides something called as Hibernate Transaction Manager. So you'll find it in the AOP. You'll find it in the AOP, I can say. Yes. Hibernate transaction handles the complicated transaction management logic as a role, people. Behind the scenes, the transaction manager invokes the transaction management methods. Okay. Yes. So that is one of the primary components which is provided by Spring Framework to handle the transactions for us. Yes. So you know what? To activate this transaction manager, so all you need to do is just use this annotation. Just sorry, not annotation. This is the XML element which you will add here, called as annotation driven in the configuration file. So which activates the transaction manager. Okay. Yes. So, and we can make use of, or we can apply that transactions using this annotation at the rate transactional. We can use at the rate transactional for that purpose. Yes. Again, you'll find that we use proxies. Okay. You'll find that here basically we'll be using proxies here for this purpose. So in the last class, I guess we did discuss about proxies, right? So day before yesterday's class. No, in the last class itself, I guess. Yeah. So how the proxies play a key role in transaction management. Sorry, in the AOP. How proxies they play a key role in the AOP. You'll find that here proxies itself are responsible for intercepting that method calls, right? Target method, target object method calls. The proxy itself is going to intercept them. Proxy itself is going to intercept them here, right? Yes. Fine. You see, here also, still to manage this transactions and all, so we use this AOP. So AOP internally again uses proxy. You see, the proxy uses transaction manager to manage the transactions on behalf of proxy's target object. Yes, target bean. So this is entirely transparent. So we don't have to worry about this proxies and all. Yes, even we never worried about proxies in the AOP, right? So we don't have to worry about it. Yes. So if you can check this here, it shows you the transaction management flow, how it works here. So you will find that when a caller calls the method, see, the AOP proxy will be called. Always, to the caller, to the clients, the proxy will be called, will be written here. Yes, always the proxy will be written like this. Yes, that is what happens. The proxy in turn will intercept that method calls. And you see the proxy, what it does here, it applies that transaction advice. Basically, it's going to apply the transaction advice here. Yes, that is what the proxy does. Yes. Okay. Now you may have some custom advisors also. That means some other advice codes which have to be applied to the target method. So proxy will make sure that it calls this transaction advice and also some additional advice types which you got if you got any. Okay, even some additional advice types if you got any. Yes. And then at last the target method will be called where you got the business logic. Okay. So it doesn't mean that always you'll be applying the transaction management code only to the repositories or DOs. Even to execute the business logic, you need to use transactions. Yes. So this is how the flow works. Okay. Yes. So AOP proxy will call the transaction advisor, which contains that advice code, transaction advice code, I can say. Advice code means the cross-cutting consent code, as I told you people. Yes. Here, the after that advice code finishes execution, the target method will be called. So in this case, you see, this transaction advice will be most of the times around advice itself, which executes before and after the target method finishes execution. It executes before and after the target method finishes execution, I can say. Yes. Okay, this is the flow. Hope you people got it. Now, how will you configure that Hibernate transaction manager here? So this is what you'll do. So if it is XML, so you'll see annotations based also later on. Yes. Okay. Now, Having understood this details, first of all, so let's try to configure the transaction management code here. Okay, yes. So first of all, if you want to work with transactions, straight away go to the configuration file. Okay, straight away go to the configuration file. You got this your Spring Bean configuration file, right? Open this file. Sorry, we have root context.xml file, right? Open this file. Now first, you have this namespaces tab. If you can check this, in the namespaces tab, just select the namespaces tab. Select the namespaces tab, and you'll find that here you'll have transaction tx schema. If you can check this, tx schema will be there. You can check this. Here the tx means transaction schema. So just select this schema, come back, make sure that you save this configuration file. Now, as I told you people, to enable declarative transactions, so we have to use the tx transaction advice. But before that, let's configure Hibernate transaction manager, which is provided by Spring Framework. Okay. Now, to this Hibernate transaction manager, you have to pass that session factory. Session factory is a dependency for Hibernate transaction manager. Okay. Yes. Just do this. Next, we need to enable the declarative transaction management support so that we can use annotations for that purpose. Tx colon annotation driven. Okay, Tx colon annotation driven. So this is the annotation which you'll use, and then the reference here. You see, transaction manager reference. You need to supply it here. The transaction bean ID you configure it here. Hibernate transaction manager. Hibernate transaction manager. Here, this is how you'll configure the transaction manager. Okay, we'll enable transactions management support. Now we are all set, I can say. Where you want to apply the transactions? I mean, where you want Hibernate, sorry, Spring Framework to manage the transactions for us. Yes. Now you see, we have this code, right? I don't want to manage the transactions on my own. Instead, we'll leave it to the framework. I'll copy this code, and here, what I'll do is, okay, this time, so previously we have managed the transactions on our own, but I don't want to do that. Okay, I don't want to do that here. You see, instead, I want the framework to handle the transactions for us. So you have to remove this code. Now we don't have to begin the transaction, commit the transaction, and all such things. Okay, so now the framework that AOP is going to help us in this regard, right? Yes. So it will transaction the it will start the transactions. It will commit the transactions. It's going to take care of the transactions. But we need to ask the framework to do that, to help to manage the transactions for us. How? Declaratively. This is where we use this annotation transactional. Okay. Yes. Once I add this annotation at the rate transactional, what happens? Say you will find that you got this arrow mark here. You see, advised by. It says this method is advised. You know, previously we used to follow a different approach. Previously, you can say that here we used to follow a different approach to apply at across to apply the advice to the target method. What we used to do, can you people tell me? If you have to apply an advice, that means cross-cutting concern code to a target method. So what we used to do, Yes, actually, we used to configure that advice code where, I mean, if you want to apply an advice to a target method, what you will do, you know the AOP terminology, sorry, you know how it works, right? What we used to do, where you will configure the details, and we use an expression to apply an advice to a target method. What is it?
Before, after.
Yeah, we call it as a point cut expression. Before and after is advice type. Before advice or after advice, that is an advice type actually. You'll find that here we have used a expression, a point cut expression to apply the advice code or advice. Advice means cross cutting consent code. Here in our case, advice is transaction management code. So we used to configure that advice to a target method using annotations. Sorry, expression, point cut expression. Where we used to specify the point cut expression, where we used to specify that point cut expression. I hope you people got the question right. Where we used to specify the point cut expression. You know, in the advice, on the top of the advice method itself, we used to specify that point cut expression on top of the advice method itself. But here we are specifying it on top of the target method. That is one difference which you can notice. You got the point, all of you? So here this time, on top of the advice method, target method itself, we are providing the details, you know, where you want to apply the advice, which is quite a different approach here. Yes. Why we are not specifying that advice, the point cut expression or advice details? We used to configure the details about the target method in the advice on top of the advice method itself, right? Now, why we are not doing it here? What do you people think? Why we are not doing it here? Where is the advice class? Advice class means the code, the class which contains the advice code. Advice code. Where is that advice class? It is part of your framework, right? It's predefined. In this case, your advice class is predefined. Advice class is actually predefined. So it's already defined. It is part of your Spring libraries now. We can't go to that class and edit that class to configure the target method details. You got the point, all of you. We can't go to that predefined class where you got that advice code for transaction management and edit that class, modify that class. Yes. Uh, that's the reason why, you see, we apply that advice details here itself on which method or for which method you want to apply that advice. Okay, for which method you want to apply the advice, you'll just configure that annotation on top of that method. That's it. So is it clear for you people, all of you? Can I have yes, please? So is this point clear? Okay. So because this time we are using a predefined advice, I guess for the first time we are using a predefined advice class. So where we have written the advice code previously in aspects, we used to define aspects, and in that aspect we used to write that advice methods, and on top of the advice method we used to configure the target method details. But this time we are using a predefined aspect. You can think of it as a predefined aspect or predefined advice. which is provided by Spring Framework, which contains the transaction management code. So now we can't go to that advice method where you got the transaction management where we got the transaction management code and apply or configure the target method details there. We can't do that. It's part of your library. It's in your Spring library. That's the reason why. So now we have to configure that advice details on top of the target methods itself directly. For which method you want the transactions to be managed here, you can just configure those details. That's it. That is what we'll be doing here. Yes. Okay. So that is a point which you need to understand. Okay. Next, there is one more important thing here. What is it? Whenever you want to use the transaction management support provided by the framework, see, most of them you'll find that here, sorry, whenever you're using the transaction management support from the framework, whenever using the transaction management support from the framework, you'll find that the way you obtain the session, you have to change it. Yes, the way you obtain the session, it has to change. How? Why? I'll tell you. This time, framework is managing the transactions for us, right? Framework is actually managing the transactions for us. So, in order to manage the transactions, framework is supposed to obtain the transaction object. How we obtain the transaction object? Can you people tell me? Please involve in the discussion. This is very, very important. Okay, this point is very important now. You need to understand it.
Can you please repeat?
So, you see, now the framework is supposed to manage the transactions. That means begin the transaction, commit the transaction, and all such things, right? So that framework needs a transaction object. So how that transaction object will be obtained generally? How the transaction object will be obtained? Yes. Here we obtain the transaction object through the session itself. Through the session. So even the framework, how it is supposed to obtain the transaction? Through the session. You got the point, all of you? Even the framework here, to obtain the transaction object, it is supposed to use the session. Session is the primary component always. Even to obtain the transaction object, you need a session. Yes. So that means framework first, it opens a session, it obtains a session, and then through the session it will acquire the transaction object. Through the session, the framework will acquire a transaction object. So that means already the framework has opened a session. So when you ask the framework to manage the transactions for us, the framework will already open a session, okay, before calling this add product method, and it obtains a transaction object, and it uses the transaction object associated to that session to manage the transaction. Okay. Now here, always a transaction object is associated to a session. Yes, this is very important point. A transaction object will be associated to a session, and through the session itself, you'll acquire the transaction object. Okay. Through the session itself, you'll be acquiring the transaction object here. Okay. Yes. So even the framework also does the same. So now framework has already acquired a session, and through the session it has acquired the transaction object. It has opened the session and acquired the transaction object. Now this method add product, it is also supposed to use the same session which is opened by the framework. This method is also supposed to use the same session which is opened by the framework. Okay. How this method here can use the same session object which is opened by the framework. That is the point here. So framework and this method has to be in sync now. They both should use the same session object to make sure that these transactions are smoothly managed. So if you use a different session, then it will be a problem. Okay. Yes. So first of all, is this point clear for you people, all of you? What I'm talking about, the session especially. So this method, it needs the same session object which is opened by the framework already. Why the framework has opened the session? To obtain the transaction object. Yes. So session and transactions will be associated. So this method also needs the same session object which is opened by the framework. Yes. So the point is here, how can we get that same session object which is opened by the framework? Yes. Yeah. Is this point clear? I got only one yes. What about others? Yes. Is this point clear first of all? Hope everyone got it. You know what? If you call this open session method, you know what happens? Will you get that session object which is created, which is opened by this framework? I can say no. You will get a new session object, and this transaction will fail because method is using one session, and your framework is using another session. Okay? Yes, this won't work. Just remember, whenever you call open session method, you will get a new session object every time. Every time you call the open session method, you will get the new session object here. Yes. So this is where we'll go for another method called as get current session. To obtain the session, use this method called as get current session. So what this get current session method does, this get current session method, you'll find that it will always, it won't create a new session. First of all, it will try to obtain the session which is already created by the framework. Yes, it will acquire or it will obtain the session which is created by the framework here. But how this method will get that session, how this get current session method will get the session which is opened by the framework. How the framework will pass over that session to this method. How this get current session method will be able to obtain that session. That is the point. You know, it is propagated through the thread. Through the thread, I can say. It is actually propagated through the thread. Yes, it is propagated through the thread. Yes. So the AOP's advice method, which is acquiring the transaction object, it will be running in the same thread context, I can say. It also uses the same thread context. So through the thread, the session is propagated to this method, I can say. Just remember this point. So we don't have to worry about, using the thread and all here. Just remember this point that through the thread context, the session is passed on to this method. Okay. And this method can acquire that current session by calling get current session method here. Okay. Yes. That is how it works. So there is no limit on that. Okay. So there is no fixed limit on that. Your application should be able to afford that. Yeah. The memory, everything, the performance matters, everything matters. So it's just like any other object. That's it. Okay. Now, don't do this mistake of closing the session. You don't have to close the session. Remove this. Just acquire the session and you use that method, call that method save method. That's it. The rest of the things are taken care by the framework here. Okay. The rest of the things will be taken care by the framework. Yes. Just a minute, please. Just a minute. Give me 1 minute. Sorry. Yeah. So now this will make your framework. There's annotation here. This will make your framework to manage the transactions for you. Okay. Yes. Now we can also configure the other transactional behaviors here, like you know, timeout. Let's say you can set the timeout. What is this timeout? Timeout, it is used to specify the time here, expiration time for the transaction. A transaction, if it doesn't execute within the specified period of time, see, within the specified time, so it will be simply terminated. The transaction will be terminated. That's it. Okay. If the transaction fails to execute within that specified period of time, then the transaction will be automatically terminated. Yes. So that is transaction timeout. So even you might have noticed it. Uh, well, in most of the cases, like in banking applications, uh, when doing net banking, or even in yeah, net banking, you see, if you don't complete the transaction within a specified period of time, automatically your transaction will expire. So you won't be able to you know complete the transaction. Yes, that is one of the most common things which you will see, right? Yes. So we can set the transaction expiration time. Next, you know what? Here you can also specify for which exceptions you want to roll back the transaction. For which for which exceptions in the method you want to roll back the transaction. Yes. Okay. So we can specify these details. You see, roll back for, let's say, SQL exception. So that means this transaction will roll back if there is an SQL exception in this method. If there is an SQL exception, this transaction will roll back. Even it is also possible to specify for which exceptions you don't want to roll back the transaction. It is also possible to specify for which exceptions you don't want to roll back the transaction here. Yes. For that, we can do this. No rollback for, let's say, just providing the null pointer. So what if you have a list of exception details which you need to specify? As of now, I'm just specifying one exception class name. You may have multiple exception classes, right? In that case, what you will do is, so you can use flower brackets. You can use flower brackets for that purpose. Yeah. Next, you can also specify the transaction propagation details. Transaction propagation. So what is transaction propagation? What is transaction propagation? Transaction flow. Okay. Could you please elaborate on this transaction flow? One transaction depends on another transaction. Actually, transaction propagation means, let me make you people understand this. So, for suppose let's take our example, order processing example. You know, here, especially take this order process order method, in which you got that business logic. Okay, you got some business logic here, right? Yes. You know, if we keenly observe this logic, now what you have, you'll read the details, product, you see, especially fetching the product details and reading the quantity, okay, which you got in the inventory from this product object. And then updating the quantity, right? We have to also update the quantity. Now we were just thinking of only one customer placing the request or placing the order. You know what? You'll find that here, what if several customers, let's say, yeah, several customers, multiple customers have placed the order. Okay, yes, several customers have actually placed the order. Yes, in that case, you know, just imagine, let's say, each order will be processed by a transaction. Okay, so this is a transaction itself, definitely. Okay, so this method, it will be executed by a transaction itself. So for 10 customers, let's say 10 customers have placed the request for, they've placed the orders. You have 10 transactions. So you see, all the 10 transactions will be operating on the same product object, right? They'll be operating on the same product object, same quantity. Don't you think we'll have some issues here, overlapping issues? Don't you think we'll have overlapping issues here? Yes, you got the point. When multiple transactions, you see, they use the same product object in which you got that quantity details, right? So let's say if one transaction is updating the quantity, the other transaction is reading the quantity. Yes. So there can be a problem. Don't you think we'll have a problem here? Hope you people got it, right? So this method, you have to make sure that you execute it under the transaction context itself. Okay, make sure that you execute this method under the transaction context. So, you have some updates to be done. So that update, we have to update the product quantity, right? Yeah, just assume that we have this transaction annotation here. Okay, yeah. Now, let's say this method, you are executing it under the transaction context. And from this method, you are calling several other methods like fetch product by ID, update product quantity. You see, these are the repository methods. Even we are calling some other methods also, like order quantity, order object method, get requested quantity, product object method, get quantity. So let's say this method is executing under the transaction context. Okay, this method is actually executing under the transaction context. And from this transaction context here, you see again, you're calling the methods, right? Yes. Now, when you call that method will execute definitely. But what about the transaction? The transaction, will it be propagated to that method also? For example, you're calling fetch product by ID method from this transaction context. So the transaction, will it be propagated to that method? That means that method also will it execute under the same transaction context? What happens? At first place, that method, does it need a transaction or not? That is also a point. So we need to really execute that method on the transaction context. So in some cases, yeah, you may need to execute that method under the transaction context. Maybe this get product by fetch product by ID method, we don't need to execute it under the transaction context. But what about update product quantity? Do we need to execute it under the transaction context? What do you people think? Do we need to execute it under the transaction context? Of course, it's a non-select DB operation, right? So what if for that method also we have a transaction context? We have configured a transaction. For this method also, we have this annotation, let's say transactional. So which is, this method is annotated with transactional at the rate transactional. Now the question is here, you see, this time this update product method will have its own transaction context. And you see, from the process order method, we are calling update product quantity method. Will they both you now you see this method, now it will execute under which contract transaction context? So you see, product update product quantity has got its own transaction context. So will it execute under the transaction context, or will it execute under this transaction context associated to that process order, or it will use both? Or will it use both? Or this process order transaction, will it be suspended for a while? We have various options here. What should happen to the transaction context? Whether it should be suspended, whether it should execute, what should happen here? So this is about transaction propagation. I mean, how it should work. I just gave you an idea, but we need to understand how to propagate the transactions and all. That is very important. How the transaction should be propagated. So you have process order method. Now, if you want this update product quantity method also to execute under the same transaction context when this method is called, when the process order method is called, I want these methods, both the methods to execute under the same transaction context. So you can just configure the details here. Okay, yeah. So let me add that library so that we can just use those annotations here for a while. Just a second. I am not getting the transaction invitation. I didn't add that forum libraries. Just a second. This one. In Spring ORM itself, you'll have those libraries. Sorry, annotations. Spring ORM. Transactional. See, from Spring Framework. Now, propagation, we can specify it. Required. What happens if I specify the propagation as required? Let's see. So propagation required. So it indicates that, you see, when the propagation setting is propagation required, a logical transaction scope is created for each method upon which the setting is applied. So each such logical transaction scope can determine rollback only status individually. Yes. With an outer transaction scope being logically independent of the inner transaction here. Yes. That means, see, let's say transactional method 1 is calling transactional method 2. Now, you see, first of all, for transaction method 1, already you got the transaction scope here, if you can check this. Already you got the transaction scope, right? So transaction created, you committed a rollback as needed. Next, you have method 2 executes in the existing transaction context itself. The method 2, what happens here? It will be executing under the existing transaction context itself. If a transaction is already created, for example, in our case, In our case, let's say the process order method is calling the update product quantity method. Already process order method has got a transaction, right? The same transaction context will be used for this update product quantity method also. Okay, the same transaction will be used for this update product quantity method also. A different transaction is not created again. Yes. Okay, hope you people got this point. Now, what if this method is called or it is invoked from another method, a non-transaction method? A non-transactional method, that means the method which is not executing under the transaction context. The method which is not executing under the transaction context. The method which is not executing under the transaction context. You see, if that method is calling this update product quantity method, then what happens? What do people think? This method in that case, will it execute under the transaction context or what happens here? So from the calling method, from the caller method is not having any transaction context. It's not executing under the transaction context. What happens to this method? How this method will execute? In the transaction context or within the transaction context or without a transaction context here? Yes. You'll find that because we have specified it as required, even if this method is called from a non-transaction context, definitely in that case a new transaction will be created for this method and this method will execute in its own transaction context. This method is going to execute within its own transaction context here. Okay, yes. So if this method is called from an existing transaction context, the existing transaction context will be used, else a new transaction context will be created here. Yes, that is what happens. Is it clear for you people, all of you? So hope you people got it. Next, for suppose, here if I set it to requires new, then what? If it is requires new, that means irrespective of whether this method is invoked from a transaction scope or not, always for this method a new transaction will be created. So this method will always execute in its own transaction scope or transaction context. This method here, it will execute always in its own transaction context here. I can see. Okay. Next, we got another method. What is it? You see, for example, now let's go to the other method which you got here. Get product by fetch product by ID. Do you think for this method you need a transaction context always? Do you think to read that product ID, product object, we need a transaction context always? Maybe it's optional. We may not need the transaction or context every time here. We may not need the transaction context every time. Okay, yeah. Just a minute, please. Just a minute. Yeah, I'm sorry. So here, yes, for this method, we don't need a transaction, right? I mean, it's not mandatory. Even if it executes under the transaction context, not a problem. For suppose, let's say, if this method is called from some other method, not from the process order method, which only wants to fetch this product details, that's it, just displaying the details. Then what? So the best option for this method would be, I'll tell you, propagation equal to supports, use supports. If you just specify it as supports, that means, you know, if you have a transaction, if you call this method from the transaction context, this method will execute under the transaction context. Even if there is no, if you call this method from a non-transaction context, still this method executes without a transaction itself. So optional. Transaction context is optional here. Okay. The transactional context is actually optional here. That is the point. I hope you people got it. So the transaction context is going to be optional. Yes. So next, quite opposite to optional, we got another propagation called as not supported. Not supported. Not supported means, you see, if this method is called from a transaction scope, then the transaction scope will be temporarily suspended till this method executes. Till this method finishes execution, the transaction scope will be temporarily suspended. Okay, till this method it executes. So when this method is called from the transaction context, okay, from the transaction scope, if you call this method, the transaction scope will be temporarily suspended. The transaction scope will not propagate to this method. This method will not execute under the transaction context. This method will not execute under the transaction context, I can say. Yes. And after this method finishes execution, the transaction scope will resume. Yes. That is how it works. Next, we got never. Never means it is more stricter version of not supported. It's more stricter version of not supported, I can say. That means this method here, it won't execute under the transaction scope. If you call this method from the transaction scope, it's going to be an exception. Okay, if you call this method from the transaction scope, it's going to be an exception, I can say. Yes. That is what happens. Okay. Next we have mandatory, quite opposite to never. We have mandatory. That means this method should always execute from the transaction context. If you execute this method from a non-transaction scope, if you execute this method from a non-transaction scope, then it will throw an error. Yes. So transaction is mandatory in this case. Transaction is actually mandatory in this case. We cannot execute this method without a transaction. Okay. So these are the various uh, transaction propagation options which you got here, which you can configure. You see, we can just declaratively configure these details, and the framework will take care of it. The framework here, it will actually take care of this uh, propagations and all for us. Everything, the transaction behavior completely, the framework will take care of it for us. Yes. So this is about the transactional support which you'll see in this framework. Okay. Yeah. So anyone got any questions? Let me know. Anyone got any questions? Okay then. So let's meet tomorrow. We'll start with Spring Boot. Okay. We'll start with Spring Boot. Today completely dedicated to transaction management. Yeah. Okay then. Bye bye. Let's meet tomorrow.